Hello and welcome to the 7th Logelloop tutorial. Today we're going over macros. First of all, what is a macro? A macro is a small program that can control parameters and plugins within Logelloop. And most importantly, macros happen automatically, triggered by a single click or MIDI message from, say, a MIDI pedal. Logelloop includes a fairly lengthy list of built-in macros, but you can also write your own macros to completely customize your sessions. You open the macro window via either the palette or by the key combination Command-D. This window shows available macros. Here we have the default macro, Add Track, but we're going to learn how to customize all this. In this window, you'll find the number assigned to the macro, the button to launch the macro, the name of the macro, and the Edit button. Toggling the X makes it so that the macro is launched when the preset is loaded. In the Project Settings window, there is a tab dedicated to macros. Here you can see all the macros available in your project. Of course, since this is a new project, the list contains only the default macros. This list can be filtered to separate Logelloop macros, global macros, and project macros. When creating a macro, you have the option to make it either a global or a project macro. Project macros will only be visible in the list of the current project. If you think you'd like to use this macro in other projects, make it a global macro so that it will be available when you open any Logelloop project on your computer. You can also look up macros using keywords. You can also edit, rename, and duplicate macros, as well as open the folder where they're located. The Macro Mapping tab shows 30 individual macro slots. You'll also have the option to launch them automatically when the project is loaded, and to edit them. I'll insert into slot 2 a macro that adds 4 tracks, and it appears in the macro window in slot 2. I'm going to remove it, and instead let's create our own macro. This one will be a project macro, but it could just as well be global. This is the macro editor. In the upper right is the name of the macro, which I'll call macro1. And beneath the name, you can add a description, which will make it easier to find later. Below that is a list of all the possible functions you can implement in your macro. There's a reference manual that describes these functions, and there are far too many to cover in one tutorial, but if you'd like to know more about a specific function, you can look it up here. I want this macro to change the panning and level of a track. Since I don't know the specific command for this, I'll look under track volume, pitch, time, speed actions, etc. And yes, there's a command called track pan mono. I'll type it into the action box, which has an autofill feature. Hold Alt-Space to open a window showing you all the functions beginning with that name. So if you know that the function you're looking for begins with a certain word, you can use autofill to find it. If I enter track, it shows me all the actions beginning with track. I'll select track pan mono. To the left of the actions box, below the list of actions, is a guide to the action, listing all the arguments the action takes. Track pan mono takes track name, operator, equals, plus, or minus, and value. I'll start by entering track 1. Next, I'll enter the equals operator, and the value takes any number between -1 and 1, so I'll select 1. Now, if I want to change the track volume, I can use the track volume action, which I'll access via autofill. By the way, if there's only one match for what you've entered, autofill will automatically select that action. I'll take a look at track volumes arguments, which are similar to those of track pan mono. And I'll enter track name, operator, and value, which here ranges from -76 decibels to 0 decibels. I'll enter -50 decibels. I'll add a wait user action, which pauses the macro until the user does something before continuing the actions listed in the macro. After a mouse click, the track pan will go to -1 and the track volume to 0 decibels. I want the macro to wait 2 seconds between the pan and volume, so I'll add sleep 2000 to achieve this. I won't go into it in this tutorial, but you have variables available to the macros to affect certain arguments or store values. You can find these variables in the macro variable viewer. I'll save the macro, and now it can be found in the list of available macros. I'll insert it in slot 2. And just to be clear, I'm putting the macro entitled macro 1 into the macro slot number 2. I'll hit save, and now it shows up in the macro window. However, it's in red, which means the macro contains an error. I can easily open the editor window and use the check function that helps you troubleshoot and displays any errors. It's telling me that there are errors on lines 2 and 10. There's a typo. I've left a space in the track name on lines 2 and 10. I'll delete the space and check again. The box displays 0 errors, so I can save it. The macro is no longer red in the window. Watch closely what happens on track 1 when I launch the macro. The pan goes to 50 on the right and the level to -50. The macro is now waiting for an action. If I click again, the pan goes to the left, and 2 seconds later, the level goes to 0 decibels. I'll show you again. The macro works as intended. If you'd like to stop a macro while it's running or waiting, hold Alt and the Start or Waiting button will switch to Stop. If you want to stop all macros at once, hold Alt-Command and the stops will turn into Stop All. I won't go further into macros, but there's a long list of macros that come with Logelloop that you can open up to learn how they work. If I click Edit on a built-in Logelloop macro, it opens in read-only mode, which only lets you view it. Another important thing to note is that in the project settings under MIDI tab, in the command section, you can configure macros to be launched via MIDI notes, CC, or program changes. You can also change macro variables with MIDI notes or CC. We haven't touched on this yet, but the counter, which corresponds to the counter variable, is also in the command window. You can also configure key commands to launch macros in the keyboard tab. That's all for macros. I hope this tutorial was helpful. If you want to look more, I encourage you to look through the built-in macros to see the extent to which macros are capable. Thanks for watching. See you next time.